Welcome to Nice and Blunt. I'm Adam Riancho, and these are my quarterback, tight end, and defensive rankings for Week 9. As always, it's intended for half PPR, and we'll begin with the players who are unranked, but it's mainly due to bye Brock Purdy and Russell Wilson of the Steelers and 49ers are not available. They are on bye. But in terms of injured players, Deshaun Watson is out, so is Aiden O'Connell, and Will Levis probably is active, but I don't think gets the start. I did rank Mason Rudolph for the moment, but it looks like Derek Carr does come back, so he's ranked, and Bryce Young will remain the starter, even though Andy Dalton is practicing in full. Let's get going, though. At number 1 at quarterback for me would be Josh Allen this week versus the Dolphins. On paper, it's a bottom 2 matchup, not a good spot, but we just saw Kyler Murray played very well against them in Miami, and this game is in Buffalo, where historically the Bills do own the Dolphins, especially at home. Josh Allen's 11-2 over the course of his career against Miami, but at home he's 6-0, undefeated with an average of 39 points on the scoreboard on offense. They're going to be lights out. And if you look at his previous 4 games before week 2 this year, that was a strange game. Tua was concussed, and at halftime, James Cook was dominating. Allen didn't need to do very much. So he was bad in week 2. But in those previous 4 games against the Dolphins, previous 4 games, an average of 31.5 points per game in fantasy, 346 passing yards, 52 rushing yards, 13 total touchdowns, 2 interceptions in only 4 games. So he's going to be lights out. I definitely trust Josh Allen. I think this week he's the best quarterback available. At number 2, I have Jalen Hurts versus Jacksonville, who gets an elite matchup. I was tempted to rank him at number 1 because the Jags are the second best matchup this season. An average of 23.4 points per game allowed the last 5 weeks, just under 300 passing yards per game, 12 touchdowns, only 2 interceptions from the Jags defense. So they can't really stop anyone. And last week, Jalen Hurts scored 35 points with 4 total touchdowns. 3 of them came on the ground. So if he gives you a rushing touchdown every week, then that floor is good for 20 points. He's averaging 21 this season, and he's bust-proof. He's a must-start. In a great matchup, he will be one of the best plays this week. At number 3, I have Lamar Jackson versus Denver, who does get a slight downgrade. The Broncos do scare you a little bit. With Patrick Surtain on Zay Flowers, maybe they will need Deontay Johnson, who they just traded for, but maybe he's too banged up to play. He didn't play last week, but Mark Andrews should be fine, and Derrick Henry always opens up the defense with the threat on the ground. So Lamar will be fine. Even though they lost last week, he still put up about his average, roughly 24, 25 points, and he is the quarterback 1 this season in fantasy. So although he didn't practice on Wednesday and Thursday with a back and knee injury, he was good to go on Friday, and he will play. He's off the injury report. So not an ideal scenario with all of that considered. He only moves down to number 3. No one's benching Lamar Jackson. At number 4, I have Jordan Love versus Detroit, who is questionable with a groin injury and didn't practice on Wednesday, but has been limited the last 2 days, Thursday, Friday. So in a divisional game, very important for the playoff tiebreakers at the end of the season. I do think he'll be active. I do trust him to be available. Maybe it gets aggravated. Maybe he doesn't finish the game, but maybe they were just being cautious last week, knowing it was against Jacksonville with the Lions up next. So I do think he'll be fine. I do think he plays. And in this matchup, in 2 games last year against Detroit, he was very good. An average of 21.2 points per game on 257 yards per game, 4 passing touchdowns, another rushing touchdown, so 5 total, with only 2 interceptions in those 2 games. Interceptions have been a problem for him this year, 9 on the season, and he has not played a full bevy of snaps. So Love does turn it over, but he's also being very consistent in the passing game from a floor standpoint. His yards are always very high, and he usually throws multiple touchdowns. So I still trust him. He's been a top 5 quarterback this year on a per game basis. And while Detroit is an average matchup, they have caught 8 interceptions over the last 5 games, but also give up 270 passing yards per game. So he'll put up his numbers. He will turn it over at least once, maybe even twice, but I still think Love is a good play. I think at worst, it could be a high-scoring game, and in catch-up mode against the Lions, he will play well. He played very well against them last Thanksgiving. So at home, I'm trusting him. I think Love is a top 5 option in week 9. Number 5, I have Jayden Daniels at the Giants, who gets a top 8 matchup here, but he's also banged up with that rib injury that did limit him a lot on the ground against Chicago last week. So if you remove the run aspect of his fantasy game, he's not the same quarterback, but the matchup is top 10, so I still trust him. They have not caught a single interception in the Giants secondary over the last 5 games. So he should be fine in that regard. I don't expect any interceptions here from Daniels. But in week 2 against the Giants, it was his worst fantasy game on the season, at least in games that he did play in full. Only 13.4, not a single touchdown, no interceptions that time around, 226 passing yards, and 44 rushing yards. So if he's still nursing that rib injury, he might not run it as much, and that could really impact his value. I worry about the upside this week. That's why I did downgrade him to number 5. But the matchup's top 10 on paper. He should be okay, and I still think he's earned must-start status. I would keep Jayden Daniels in my lineup if I have him. At number 6, I have Dak Prescott at Atlanta, and the Falcons are the number 13 matchup, so kind of league average. But in the last 4 games, they have allowed 10 passing touchdowns and only caught 4 interceptions. So I do think projecting 3 touchdowns for Prescott this week is very legit. I think it's a safe bet, honestly, and it's a must-win game for them. Even if they lose, Dallas will be competitive and will at worst get some garbage time to pad the stats. I think they'll be trying to come back in the fourth quarter. So I do think Dak can also throw for 300 plus. I think he has a very safe floor. So even with a interception in this game, I think he'll be fine. In fantasy, I think he's a top 10 play this week. The ceiling is now unlocked now that CeeDee Lamb is fully engaged. So I trust Dak rest of season. The floor should be top 10 about every week. Number 7, I have Joe Burrow versus Las Vegas, and it was a tough week last week, especially without T. Higgins, who's not going to play. He's doubtful for this game. So there is some concern. The run game was really bad last week, so this week it will be a lot more complimentary, and I also think Chase Brown will contribute in the passing game with some catches. I do think Burrow will get on track because it's pretty much a must-win game for their season. This win is pretty critical, so is every win after that. So I do still trust Burrow from a floor standpoint. He will remain competitive, and Jamar Chase is still on the field, and Gesicki has stepped up a little bit. So I still think Burrow's a top 10 play. I would still start him against Las Vegas. I think he'll be fine. At number 8, I'm still going to start Kyler Murray versus Chicago. Tough matchup here. Bottom 3, the Bears rank number 30, only allowing 11.7 points per game with only 230 passing yards, only 3 touchdowns, and 5 interceptions over the last 5 games. Last week, they did hold Jayden Daniels out of the end zone until the clock hit 0. So keep that in mind. It could happen again here, but the Cardinals offense has more weapons. Overall, they should be fine, and Kyler always runs it a little bit. So that aspect of his game keeps the floor high. The ceiling is always in play, and he always has that scary upside. He could go off any given week. So Kyler remains a top 10 play. I don't think I would bench him, but overall a slight downgrade. I'm not expecting him his best game of the season against the Bears. It won't be as good as last week. Number 9, I'm starting Sam Darnold as well. The Vikings quarterback has been pretty safe this season. He has 14 passing touchdowns, and that gives him a top 12 floor pretty much every week. The matchup here also ranks top 11. The Colts only have 2 interceptions on the year. So I trust Darnold to keep it clean. I don't think he turns it over. And he has the weapons to hang around in a potential shootout. So the team will be fine. The offense will probably score 30 plus. He also gets TJ Hockenson available on the team. So that really boosts his floor. You trust Darnold a lot, and the ceiling should be open. Darnold, I think, will be top 10 in week 9. At number 10 in the same game, I have Joe Flacco at Minnesota. Really good matchup here. The Vikings rank number 9 against quarterbacks. They give up 19 points per game on average the last 5 weeks. 300 yards per game is the most in the NFL in this sample size. Nobody gives up more yards than the Vikings. They also catch a lot of interceptions, 8 interceptions over the last 5 weeks. So 13 touchdowns is nice, but there will be at least one pick for Flacco. He will make at least one mistake, in my view. But Richardson was really holding this team back. With Flacco under center, you trust the floor, and they're pretty underrated. I think they have very legit weapons, and in a very good matchup, I think Josh Downs and Pittman will go off. So Taylor gets a little more involved in the passing game. There's more checkdowns. Flacco's going to hover around the top 12 every week. I think he's a great play. And in a good matchup like this, I have him top 10. I really trust his floor. I could easily see him throw for well above 300 yards and multiple touchdowns. We saw him do that against Jacksonville a few weeks ago, and that ceiling is open. He could give you 30 points any given week. So love this offense. I think Shane Steichen really adds a boost of value. Flacco's a good pickup if still available on the waiver wire. At number 11, I have Kirk Cousins versus Dallas, who gets a top 6 matchup. The Cowboys give up over 20 points per game to the position the last 5 weeks. 35 rushing yards per game, though, is a big reason why. And if you take that out of the equation, as you would probably expect for Cousins, it doesn't look as good. But if Kyle Pitts is consistently involved in this offense, then Cousins' floor is very safe because London has really played well this year. So has Darnell Mooney. That third option really gives Cousins a lot more value. So there's a lot of reasons to trust Kirk Cousins, but at the same time, I'm not ready to fully endorse him like top 6 or 7 because we've only seen him play elite against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Against everyone else, he's been kind of mediocre, and I want to see it against a different defense than the Bucs because they're not going to face the Bucs again this season. Both divisional matchups are over already. So that is where I'm a little concerned. If that's really the only reason why Cousins is playing well, then it could be a problem. He could burn you once again. He was bad 2 weeks ago. Last week, he was lights out. So I want to see it one more time, but in a good matchup, I think he will be top 12. At number 11, I do think Cousins deserves a start in most settings. At number 12, I have Baker Mayfield at Kansas City, who's been a lights out top 3 quarterback this year. But against the Chiefs, I would like to pump the brakes. I was way too dismissive last week. I ranked Baker way too low, and I apologize if I told you to bench him for maybe a guy like Mahomes, for instance. But it's just, how good can they really be against a great defense like the Chiefs? The Chiefs are a bottom 10 matchup for quarterbacks, only giving up 202 passing yards per game, an average of 14 points from opposing quarterbacks in the last 5. So could be a rough spot here. I think it will be a competitive game. But Baker is number 1 in the NFL in passing touchdowns. He has 21 on the season, and he threw another 3 last week. So I do trust him. I think that's something to buy in with him, and it's not like Cade Otton can't step up. McMillan and the other receivers, though, don't give me a ton of confidence. So given the Chiefs are so good at limiting running backs this year, maybe Rashad White and Bucky Irving don't contribute that much in the passing game, and that could cap his upside. But he's been so good this season, I think he's still a worthwhile starter. I'll still trust the floor despite a downgrade against Kansas City. At number 12, I still think Baker is a decent start. In the same game, right behind him, I have Patrick Mahomes versus Tampa, who gets the best matchup on paper. 2 of these last 5 games are against Kirk Cousins, but in those last 5, they allow 26 points per game to opposing quarterbacks on 293 passing yards per game, 15 touchdowns, and 3 interceptions. So on paper, Mahomes should dominate, but he's been bad this season, very disappointing. And last week against Las Vegas, he did not step up as much as I thought. He was okay, he was fine, but he was not top 5, and I did give him too much of an endorsement. So I apologize, a little bit too excited, and that's why I don't fully trust him to be top 10. He's just not the quarterback you drafted, not the same anymore. And although Worthy is better, getting more involved, you really need Kelce to step up, and that's not something I trust on a week-to-week basis. So Mahomes has a very low floor, averaging less than 15 points this season. I don't trust him. I don't think you have to start him, but the matchup is so good it indicates you should upgrade him. So at quarterback 13, one of the best streamers on the week, but if you have good options already, I don't think you have to start Mahomes no matter what. You could keep him on the bench, and I wouldn't fault you for doing that. Number 14, I have Bo Nix at Baltimore, who's shockingly been very good this season, and rushing yards are a big reason why. Bo Nix is averaging 32 rushing yards per game this season. That's on par with guys like Drake Maye and Justin Fields, and not too far behind Kyler Murray or Jalen Hurts. So Bo Nix, very relevant in the run game, and that is what you can't forget when assessing his value. He gets a top 3 matchup in the passing game as well. The Ravens have a bad secondary this year, giving up 309 passing yards per game over the last 5 weeks with 13 touchdowns, only 3 interceptions, 22.9 points per game, 2 quarterbacks. So Nix gets a very legit upgrade overall, and last week he did start to get going. In the passing game, he looked a lot better than previously. So I'm starting to trust him more. I think in this Sean Payton offense, they will score more points as the weeks go by. As he gets more comfortable, the rookie will step up. But those rushing yards keep the floor very high. He throws few interceptions as well, and this is not a matchup that scares me. I do think Nix is a top 15 play this week. He's been good as of late. At number 15, I have Jared Goff at Green Bay, who is 4-2 versus the Packers as a Detroit Lion in the last 3 years. But Goff in his last 5 games versus the Packers is only averaging 14.4 points per game despite winning most of the time. 228 yards per game, 7 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, and you know he gives you about nothing on the ground. So he is on a heater at the moment, but in this matchup, it's not the best spot. I trust his floor, just like last week, even though he only had 85 yards, he still had 3 touchdowns and put up over 14 fantasy points. I think 14 is guaranteed for Goff, but I worry that they pivot to the run game a little bit more, and you know the Packers defense has looked a lot better this season. They've forced a lot of turnovers, so I think it could be the end of the road in terms of this historically efficient run that Goff has been on. While I don't think he goes over 18 points, I think he's guaranteed to give you 14, and 16 flat is pretty much my projection for Goff this week. I think he's bust proof, but I just don't know if this is the game where he gives you that ceiling. But I could be wrong to downgrade him. He does have 12 passing touchdowns over the last 12 games, at least 2 in each of those games, only 1 interception in that sample size. So he's been great from a passing standpoint. Goff is lights out. But if Jameson Williams was active, I'd feel a little bit better about him. I think that ceiling is missing without the deep threat, JMO, on the field. So just number 15, more of a floor play. I think he's very safe, but I would rather go with a guy like Flacco or even Bo Nix off the waiver wire this week. At number 16, a great pickup off the waiver wire would be Drake Maye at Tennessee, and he is dealing with a concussion. He may still not play against the Titans this week, but it sounds like he will. He has been limited in practice, so I'm optimistic he's available, and this matchup does rank top 10. The Titans give up 18.8 points per game on average the last 5 games. 9 passing touchdowns, only 1 interception, but less than 200 passing yards per game. So Maye is possibly going to be limited in that regard. In the passing game, I kind of worry about it. But in the run game, he's been fantastic. Even though he left last week in the first quarter, he still put up over 11 points thanks to 40-plus rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. So he was great last week, and in 3 fantasy games, despite not playing the full bevy of snaps, he's still averaging 17.3 points. He has been a top 10 quarterback when active. So the value is very legit. I do think the rookie can keep it up, and I think he has a very high ceiling, unlike some of these other players I have ranked above him. So don't be surprised if I rank him top 10 next week. While this isn't my favorite matchup possible, it's not a downgrade at all, and Maye, if he's active, could really pay off. I think he'll be a key backup to own rest of season, and he might be considered a starter. There is Josh Allen level upside because of those rushing yards, and let's face it, probably a lot of garbage time as well. They're not going to be that competitive most of the season, but he will keep throwing it as part of his development. He will chuck it like crazy. But it's really the rushing yards that has me really interested in picking up Maye. I kind of feel too low ranking him here at 16. I think he could be better than both Baker and Mahomes in week 9. I kind of want to put him top 12. At number 17, I have Caleb Williams at Arizona, who I still think is a legit play this week. I think he's a decent streaming option if you need to replace someone like Brock Purdy. But this is the last chance I'm really giving Caleb before my faith starts to waver. I still believe in him and this overall offense, but it kind of feels like the last chance before my patience wears out. He has had some big games. There have been some flashes, but there's also been a lot of games with less than 10 fantasy points. And with these caliber of receivers, it just shouldn't be the case. So he's too boom bust, a little too volatile to fully trust. But in a decent matchup against Arizona, I do think he could go off. I kind of feel like I'm underrating him. I think he could be top 10. I thought he was last week, but he wasn't. And that's why I just can't quite endorse him. There's still a lot of risk with the rookie Caleb Williams. So as much as I want to believe in him, he may have been overhyped, and I want to prevent myself from digging myself into a hole. With Caleb, it could really burn you like it did last week. So tough spot, don't trust it, but there is some upside. He could approach 30 points like he has in the past. At number 18, I'm interested to watch Matthew Stafford in this game. At Seattle, it is a top 7 matchup. The Seahawks allowed 19.8 points per game to opposing quarterbacks on just under 270 yards per game, 11 touchdowns, 3 interceptions over the last 5 games. So Stafford has unlocked his upside last week against the Vikings. We saw him throw for 4 touchdowns with those receivers back healthy, and 2 of them went to Demarcus Robinson, but Kyren Williams will more often score on the ground than through the air. So that's going to cap his upside. Kyren's involvement on the goal line is a factor. And in Stafford's last 4 games against Seattle, he's not been fantastic. Only 4 passing touchdowns, 3 interceptions, but 283 yards per game is a decent floor. But without many touchdowns, only 13.8 points per game, you need multiple touchdowns from Stafford to pay off. So that's what is so critical with no rushing stats at all. There's not a very high ceiling. And while he is interesting in the quarterback 2 conversation, a weekly streaming consideration for him, I don't think this is his best game of the year, and I'd like to see it happen again before I start ranking him top 12. He was really bad without Puka or Kupp on the field, and they could get hurt again. It is possible. Njoku is already banged up, but offensive lineman Joe Noteboom is expected to return as well this week, and the offense is getting a lot healthier. Stafford is definitely top 20 when everyone is healthy. At number 19, I have Geno Smith versus the Rams, who hasn't been great in his last 4 games against the Rams, only averaging 15.2 points per game with 6 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, and only 231 passing yards per game. But with DK Metcalf back on the field and the rain no longer a factor, Geno should bounce back after that Bills game. But in division, probably resembles these career average numbers. I'm not expecting the best game for Geno, and he has thrown for a lot of yards this season, but not many touchdowns, only 8 passing touchdowns in 8 games. So he's just a floor play in general, especially in this game. I do not think it's a great one for Geno. Number 20 is Justin Herbert at Cleveland in my ranks. I do think Herbert is an interesting pickup off the wire, but you probably want to see it one more time before you fully endorse it. However, in the last 2 games, he is averaging 314 passing yards per game, and that includes all of the injuries he has at receiver. And in this matchup, it looks like Quentin Johnston and DJ Chark will be back on the field, so they are getting a lot healthier in this passing game. They might be relying on Herbert a lot more rest of season, and they are not force-feeding it to J.K. Dobbins as much lately because they can't. His health is too brittle to risk, and especially while Gus Edwards is on IR, they would be decimated if they lost Dobbins. So they are asking a bit more of Justin Herbert, and with weapons improving overall, I do think there's a bit more upside than there has been the last 2 games for Herbert. And he has been pretty good the last 2 weeks. He's been pretty efficient in fantasy. He has been stepping it up. So I do think he's getting back on track now that he's coming alive. I do think the ceiling is no longer capped, and this ranking at number 20 kind of feels too low. I could see a lot of rushing yards against Cleveland. They give up 32 per game to opposing quarterbacks. So Herbert, a decent floor play, but at this point, I would only trust him in 2 quarterback leagues. He's not quite there in a 1 quarterback format. Outside the top 20, you're probably benching all of these players, but there is a top 5 matchup looming for Derek Carr this week. The Panthers are not good in the secondary. We saw Bo Nix torch them last week, and the Panthers don't scare you. I could see Carr play well. He played well against them in week 1 back when we thought the Saints were good. But he loses Rashid Shaheed, and that really removes the ceiling for Carr. Without that deep passing touchdown, it's a little less safe where he already wasn't that good in the first place. So I'm not ready to endorse him. The matchup's good, but I just don't trust him personally. And who knows, maybe Taysom Hill vultures him on the goal line. So if you start him and he burns you, I think you'd be more disappointed in yourself for making that judgment rather than him. You know Carr comes with risk. So no thanks this week at 21. I think I'll pass despite the good matchup. At 22, I think I'm still going to pass on Jameis Winston, but there is a lot of upside. I could see him really play well rest of season and crack the top 15 on a weekly basis. I think he could be a very good streaming option rest of season. But last week was a great matchup against the Ravens. It's nowhere near as good against the Chargers, and maybe his receivers are legit, but we remember Jameis as a turnover machine, and that's always possible. He could still throw another 20 interceptions with less than 10 games left on the year. So Jameis still not safe enough, but is appealing. It's possible the LASIK surgery and all his time as a backup offers him the opportunity to get his career back on track. I'd keep an eye on Jameis. He might be a big pickup next week. Number 23, I have Gardner Minshew at Cincinnati, who's underrated this week, but does have some sneaky upside. The matchup does rank top 4 against the Bengals, and the Bengals defense could easily sleep on the Raiders this week. And if Bowers and Jacoby Myers do find the end zone, then Minshew can also pair that with 250 plus yards easily. The Bengals give up 257 on average. They've allowed 22.7 points per game to opposing quarterbacks the last 5 weeks, and I think in DFS, Minshew is a lot more interesting because of his cheap price, but obviously in season long, I don't trust him enough to actually start. So only in a very deep super flex league would I consider it, but there is potential. This matchup indicates you could upgrade Minshew higher than I already have. At 24 and 25, I did tell you to bench both Rodgers and Stroud last night, and Stroud had a very bad game, no touchdowns on Thursday, but Rodgers did throw for 3 touchdowns. The first half was brutal, but he did pay off. He probably finishes higher than this ranking at 24. Number 26, though, I am benching Tua for sure this week. He has very bad stats against Buffalo. In his last 5 games, only an average of 10.7 points per game on barely 204 passing yards, 6 touchdowns, 6 picks in those 5 games. So I really don't trust him. He threw 3 interceptions back in week 2 against Buffalo, and each of his last 3 games, the interceptions have increased 1 to 2 to 3. If the trend keeps up, he would be throwing 4 this time around. So it's officially November, and I think he's lost a lot of faith. He could always have another concussion and exit the game early, but last year in November and December, he was really bad. In his final 9 games, he threw only 11 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. To get more than 1 touchdown from Tua is very unlikely. I would honestly consider dropping him. More likely than not, I don't want him on my team. At number 27, I have Trevor Lawrence at Philadelphia, who probably still has a decent floor against the Eagles, but the matchup is actually bottom 5 over the last 5 games. Their young secondary has really stepped up, only giving up 199 passing yards per game, 4 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, 13.1 points per game. So a downgrade. Lately, you can't trust quarterbacks against the Eagles, but Brian Thomas appears to be healthy enough to play. I think he'll be active in this game. So that does open some upside for Lawrence, but you're really hoping for some rushing value as well. The loss of Christian Kirk is a bummer, but it's not as devastating given Thomas is not going to miss any time. So I don't trust Lawrence this week. I think it's a bad game for him, but he has played better than this ranking would suggest this season. I could be too low on Lawrence by as many as like 10 spots. I could envision a safer game, but I think against the Eagles, I'd rather pass on T-Law this week. At number 28, I think we're in the fuck no territory. These last 3 are not cracking my lineup at all. Mason Rudolph against the Patriots, the bottom 6 matchup. And while he did look fine against the Lions, they lost to the best team in the league. It was not competitive. I'd like to see him play well against a legit defense, but not expecting much from Rudolph. That's for sure. Not expecting anything from Daniel Jones either against Dan Quinn. He has been terrible in his last 5 games versus Dan Quinn. Daniel Jones only averages 11.1 points per game, 160 passing yards, only 3 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. He is bad. So no thank you, not expecting anything. Daniel Jones could get benched for Drew Lock at any time. It could definitely happen in this game. Number 30, last player ranked would be Bryce Young versus the Saints, and there's no chance I really ever start him, but he did throw for 2 passing touchdowns last week. Maybe I am dismissing him too much. Let's move on to tight end, though, where there are 2 critical players on bye. George Kittle and Pat Freiermuth, usually ranked top 15 at the worst, are unavailable. Kittle is the tight end 1 this year, so you can't start him. Dallas Goedert remains out, so can't start him either. But we do get TJ Hockenson back off IR, so that's some positive news. Let's get into these rankings, though. At number 1, I do have Brock Bowers at Cincinnati. Kittle is on bye, so that makes Bowers the de facto number 1. He is the only other tight end this season to average more than 10 points per game on the year. There's some other players that have looked good lately, but on the year, Bowers has been the most consistent option. He leads all NFL tight ends with 8.1 targets per game and 6.5 catches per game. The volume is the safest bet with Bowers, more so than anyone else this season. So going to trust him at number 1. He also gets a top 7 matchup. The Bengals have allowed 4 touchdowns this season, and although Bowers only has 1 touchdown himself, I think betting on that touchdown is not a bad bet. I think he could find the end zone in this game. So Bowers is my number 1, but at number 2, I do have Cade Otton, who I considered ranking at number 1. It's 2 straight games with 10 targets, and he's lived up to the billing. Last week, he was excellent with 2 touchdowns. He was one of the best plays you could find overall, not just at the tight end position, although it did go off all the way across the board. So Otton is a lock. He also gets a top 2 matchup. The Chiefs have been burned all year by tight ends. They give up 81 yards per game to the position. So he will be great. Another 10 targets is guaranteed, and I would lock him into the lineup. Rest of season, I think he now takes on the Chris Godwin role. Even when Mike Evans comes back, I think Otton is a top 5 tight end, guaranteed. At number 3, I have David Njoku versus the Chargers, and in his last 3 games, he has a minimum of 7 targets, with 14 in Week 7. That gives him an average of 13 points per game, 9.3 targets per game, 6.7 catches, 56 yards, and 2 touchdowns over the last 3 games. Njoku has been great, so I definitely trust him. While it looks like Tillman might be the number 1 target for Winston, Njoku is still involved and still a key piece of this offense. One of the best tight ends overall, especially with Winston at quarterback now that Cooper is out of the offense. Number 4, I have Trey McBride versus Chicago, who has been the safest floor play at tight end all year long, but he still has no touchdowns on the season. So that is a tiebreaker for me. I would consider ranking him at number 1 if he had scored like even just 2 touchdowns this year, but without a single touchdown, that does kind of cap the ceiling. But he's right behind Bowers for number 2 in terms of target volume and catches, with 8 targets per game, 6 catches as well. McBride is a lock. He's averaging 64 yards per game. He is bust proof, and he's a guaranteed top 5 tight end. He is the only one we drafted to be top 5 that actually paid off with that return on investment. So love McBride. He's very safe and is a lock in your lineup every week. Last week he had 12 targets, and he's starting to look unguardable. At number 5, I have Travis Kelce versus Tampa, who also had 12 targets last week and did step up in a big way against the Raiders. He gets a top 4 matchup against Tampa Bay this week. They give up just under 12 points per game with 4 touchdowns to tight ends on the season. So the odds that he finds the end zone are pretty decent. I do think Kelce has a good game for the 2nd week in a row, but there have been some games where he has really disappointed this year. So I'm not quite ready to tell you he's back to being that elite top 2 option, but this week I do think he's top 5. I do think the touchdown is available, and after that 12 targets in week 8, you definitely earned a bit more trust from Kelce. So I think I would just keep him in the lineup. I don't think I'd completely bench him. There's no reason to give up on Kelce at this point, but you know they're saving him for the playoffs. There will be some games where he does kind of disappear. Number 6, I have Kyle Pitts versus Dallas, and he scored 2 touchdowns last week, but historically he struggles in that department. I'm not ready to expect it from him on a weekly basis. He still does not have a single year in his career with more than 3 touchdowns. So until that changes, we'll hold off on fully buying in to that ceiling. But the yardage is now a very legit thing. He has 4 straight games since the bagel with high usage, a minimum of 65 yards in each of those games, an average of 79. So his athleticism is on display. I officially trust him as a safe option. I think he's locked in the top 10, but now he's creeping closer to the top 5. I think if you do start to get touchdowns consistently, he could be a top 3, top 4 tight end rest of the way, but I need to see those touchdowns more consistently. Until then, he's still a must start, but not quite top 5. At number 6, I think he's a lock in your lineup this week. At number 7, I think Evan Engram will probably be a lock in your lineup rest of season because Christian Kirk did go down with injury. He's out for the year. But Evan Engram really stepped up in his place last season. Without Christian Kirk, Engram was a league winner, and he scored a lot of touchdowns in that sample size. So that's what was missing for Engram. He struggles to score touchdowns typically in this offense, but with no Christian Kirk, it should be a lot more available. He absorbed Kirk's role entirely last season. So I'm not quite ready to say it's going to be a 1-for-1 repeat of last year's situation because now Brian Thomas is there and Thomas looks better than Ridley. So I want to see it before I bump up Engram into the top 5, but it's possible he sees like 10 targets per game the rest of the way, and he's a legitimate top 2 tight end every single week. So I would definitely start him with confidence, but this matchup is actually the worst on paper. The Eagles gave up only 5.6 points per game to tight ends this season, not a single touchdown overall. So this will be an interesting test. Does the matchup actually hold true? Is it actually a downgrade, or is it just who they faced? And is Engram going to step into that elite volume role in this offense like he did last year? So I'm going to start him at number 7. I think he is a good play, but he may not be as elite as last season. I'd like to see it before I put him that high in the rankings. At number 8, I think you're starting Mark Andrews with confidence. He has officially overtaken Isaiah Likely in fantasy points this year. He gets the Broncos this week, maybe not the best matchup, but they don't have linebackers to cover tight ends. It's pretty irrelevant for Andrews, in my opinion. And he also has 4 touchdowns over the last 3 games. So you can overlook the lack of volume. Although he has at least 4 targets in each of those games, he never exceeds 5. So you'd like that to be higher, but it's still safe enough to trust. He's catching all but one of those targets. So he's been reliable, especially in the red zone. He's almost averaging 50 yards per game. And if he continues to score a touchdown every week, then he will be a good option. And touchdowns are why I ranked him top 5 entering the year. He was averaging at least 7, if not 8 or 9 every single season entering this year. So I still trust Andrews. His role is back, and he is a safe option because of those touchdowns. At number 9, I have Cole Kmet at Arizona, who's a bit too volatile for me to rank back in the top 5. I was a bit too gung-ho and too high on him last week with Kmet, but he's still really talented, very high upside. Every single week he could offer 2 touchdowns. It's always possible with Kmet. So that's why last week was so disappointing. Only 1 catch for 10 yards reminds you of the lack of floor. There is some risk, but I still think the talent's too good to ignore. With Kmet, I still think he's a top 10 play, but he is touchdown dependent. At this point in the rankings, though, just like Andrews, that's kind of the name of the game. So Kmet, still top 10. I would still start him, but not as safe as I thought last week. At number 10, I have Sam LaPorta at Green Bay, and I think the lack of Jameson Williams in this game is very important, does really help his value in this matchup. The Packers are top 10. They give up over 11 points per game to the position and 3 touchdowns to tight ends on the year. So LaPorta could find the end zone. Last year against the Packers, he was decent. He did score 1 touchdown, averaged 52 yards per game, but he's been disappointing this season. Not what you expected, but the touchdowns have been hitting a bit more consistently as of late. So he is gaining some steam, but you are disappointed. You drafted him to be the tight end 1, and he has not lived up to that billing. So at some point, it could pay off. He could explode. He's probably due to explode sometime soon, but until we see it, the highest I can put him is number 10. There's a lot of good tight ends this year, and he has not been the safest of them all. So LaPorta at number 10, I'd still probably start, but on the fringe here, I understand if you found a better option like Otton or Njoku off of the waiver wire. Number 11, I have Dalton Kincaid versus Miami, who gets a bottom 5 matchup. Not good. They have yet to give up a tight end touchdown this season, but Kincaid has flipped between 6 and 7 targets each of the last 5 games. His volume is pretty safe, and guaranteed, but the touchdowns get spread around pretty evenly on this team. So there's a lot of mouths to feed. It could move away from him any given matchup. And although he's interesting all of the time, he still has not taken that next step that we expected from him entering the year. So just like LaPorta, a bit of a disappointment. He is averaging 7 points per game this year, which is okay, but not great. It's tied with LaPorta and Jake Ferguson for just a decent floor, but not that elite upside we wanted. At number 12, I have Tucker Kraft versus Detroit, who has offered that elite upside. Kraft is the tight end 3 in points per game because of 5 touchdowns on the year, and Musgrave is not ready to return, so it definitely can continue, but he only gets like 4 targets per game. The volume is not safe, but for some reason it keeps hitting with Kraft in this offense. So I do feel too low ranking him here at number 12, but there's a lot of good names above him. It feels like he's still just a risky streamer, and at some point the luck could dry up. But this week I still think he's one of the better options. If you're just hoping for a touchdown, hard to find a better bet than Tucker Kraft. But I do think TJ Hockenson has very high upside this week and probably finds the end zone. The matchup is good. The Colts have given up 4 touchdowns to tight ends this year. So Hockenson might get that welcome back to the field touchdown that we've seen happen for a lot of players returning from injury. And this could be a good feel-good matchup for Hockenson in primetime to find the end zone. But before I see it, I'm not going to rank him top 3 like he was last year. He does have that potential, but it's possible he's not fully recovered. They could really slowly ramp him up to full workload, and the chemistry with Darnold might not be the same as it was with Cousins. So we'll see what it looks like before I tell you have to start Hockenson. I'm only putting him in the streaming conversation. Without a touchdown, I don't expect a ton of work for Hockenson that keeps him viable with all these other names above him. So just want to see it before I fully endorse it, but I could easily see Hockenson be ranked top 5 as early as next week. At number 14, I have Jake Ferguson at Atlanta, and he's tied with LaPorta and Kincaid with 7 points per game this season. But off the bye, he didn't do very much last week. He did have 8 targets, 6 catches, but only for 23 yards. So he's just a check down machine, very frustrating. He also has not scored a touchdown yet this year. So he is due, but it's frustrating to watch. It's not a safe bet to happen. And until it does, I just can't quite envision that high-end ceiling that I was hoping for entering the year. So he's a fine start, pretty bust-proof, but not that interesting. There are some more appealing options with higher upside that you could still find on the waiver wire. And for instance, Hunter Henry, who I have ranked 1 spot behind him, I kind of want to put much higher. It's dependent on Drake Maye starting. If that happens, I probably do bump up Hunter Henry, maybe even above guys like Kincaid and Kraft, because he's the number 1 target in this offense for sure. With Drake Maye, that ceiling is definitely a lot more interesting. So that's what I'm hoping for. It looks like Maye might be able to go. And even last week with Brissett, he still had a 5-catch, 45-yard, 7-point floor in this offense. So Henry, I think, is bust-proof. I think a very good streaming option, one of the better tight ends to have on your bench. But at 15, there's probably not enough space in the lineup. Unless you're trying to replace Freiermuth or Kittle, you probably won't have Henry in your lineup this week. At 16, though, Mike Gesicki has stepped up in place of T. Higgins. It's the 3rd time this year that he's done that. And Higgins is doubtful in week 9, so it will happen again. He did have 8 targets last week and is averaging about 7 per game when Higgins is inactive. So the floor is decent. I'm not expecting a touchdown, but Gesicki is in the streaming conversation. With no Higgins, he is a part of this offense. Number 17, Geno Smith has stepped up a bit. In week 2, he had 53 yards on 6 catches against the Dolphins, and he has played somewhat well the last several games. So he's interesting, but at this point, he's probably not safe enough to bet on. The last guy I'd probably consider starting if I was desperate off the waiver wire. At number 18, I did tell you Dalton Schultz was probably worth a bench on Thursday night, and he did have some deep targets, but they didn't hit. He was not viable. He has not stepped up with no Nico Collins. At 19, I have Zach Ertz at the Giants, and he's a typical good floor play, but only has 1 touchdown on the year, and usually that's not a safe bet, so I will probably pass on Ertz, but he did put up 62 yards against the Giants back in week 2. He's not the worst bet overall. At 20, I have Will Dissly at Cleveland, who has stepped up lately. The Chargers are getting healthier, but Dissly has earned more respect. He will get the most snaps at tight end for the Chargers. So that is something. It's not terrible, but actually starting Dissly does sound kind of gross in practice. So no thanks at number 20. I'm probably going to pass. And then these last 5 have good matchups and a lot of interesting upside, but they probably aren't safe enough to trust. In terms of volume, I probably will pass again. Taysom Hill, though, at Carolina, could put up a lot of yards. In his last 5 games, he is averaging just under 40 rushing yards on them, and they are the best run defense matchup overall. So could work out. They have given up 6 touchdowns to tight ends as well this season. Not a bad matchup for Taysom, but he wasn't great last week, filling in his first week back. At number 22, I have Noah Fant versus the Rams, and the matchup is top 3. Fant does have 3 games this season with over 60 yards, and maybe he finds the end zone. The Rams could let that happen. They have given up 4 touchdowns this year, so could work out for Fant, but last week he wasn't great, so not dying to trust him. I did tell you Conklin was probably worth benching. At number 23, here he is, and then Grant Calcaterra probably steps up again with no Goddard, and this matchup is top 5. They have given up 5 touchdowns to tight ends this year. So Calcaterra could pay off against Jacksonville, but feels weird to trust. I doubt it's worth betting on. And lastly, Adam Troutman did have a good game last week, and the matchup is top 7. The Ravens give up 76 yards per game to the position overall this year. So Troutman maybe gets involved. It looks like Dulcich is an afterthought, and Troutman may have earned a bit more trust from Bo Nix. So those are the top 25 tight ends. Now let's wrap it up with defense and try and finish this video in under an hour. At number 1, I'm going with the Saints at Carolina this week. If you get a matchup against Bryce Young and the Panthers, that's a safe enough floor for me to trust. There's always turnover potential and upside in this matchup. So give me the Saints at number 1 this week, and the Eagles at number 2 at home versus the Jaguars. It looks like Brian Thomas will play, but the Eagles should lock up Tank Bigsby. They have a very good run defense, and ultimately I have no faith in the Jags overall. At number 3, I have the Commanders at the Giants. In division, good spot here. Should be a low-scoring game. And Dan Quinn has made very consistent progress with this defense overall. So especially in the secondary, I love what they're doing. And against Daniel Jones, they're going to tear him up. Tracy could do some damage, but I see some turnover upside here for sure. I think the Commanders are a very safe play against Daniel Jones. At number 4, I have the Chargers at Cleveland against Jameis Winston. There's always some potential for interceptions. And the Chargers defense is very sneaky this season. Very good, very safe. High floor. They rarely give up more than 20 points. So that probably happens again. I don't see any risk with the Chargers this week. Their schedule rest of season is also really nice. Go ahead and take a look at it. And if you like it, if you can, you should pick them up. At number 5, I have the Titans versus New England. And against Jacoby Brissett, the floor would be a lot higher, but there is some risk given Drake Maye might get the start. So if that happens, I would bump them down. We'll find out on Saturday if it is actually likely to happen, but there is some turnover potential regardless. So I think they're a fine play at home after a humiliating defeat, giving up 50 plus points. They should play a bit better. They should wake up a little bit. At number 6, I have the Chiefs versus Tampa, and although Baker is not the best opponent to go against, the Chiefs find a way every week. Their run defense is the best in the NFL, and they're a safe, matchup-proof top 10 play every week rest of season. I'd be fine having them as my starter and just never taking them out of the lineup, regardless of matchup. I think they're a safe option every single week. At number 7 and 8, I did tell you to start both Jets and Texans on Thursday night, and the Jets were the better play indeed, and the Texans did hold them to 21 points overall. But the Malachi Corley fumble did help a lot, and it could have been a lot worse for the Texans. Maybe they weren't as good as I expected, but the Jets were great. The Jets were perfectly fine in your lineup. At number 9, I have the Bills versus Miami, who do own this matchup, especially at home. Tua threw 3 interceptions against them back in week 2, and I think they're a very good play. I trust them against the Dolphins. They normally play very well. At number 10, I have the Bears at Arizona, and although the Cardinals are not the best matchup in general, their offense can be tough. The Bears are still a top 10 overall unit. On defense in fantasy, I think they are safe enough to stay in your lineup rest of season. So, not ideal, but they did hold Washington out of the end zone until the clock hit 0, and it could happen again against Arizona. I do think the Bears are a fine start this week. At number 11, I have the Patriots at Tennessee, and you'd probably feel a bit better about them in your lineup with Will Levis at quarterback. But it looks like Rudolph is probably the starter. He's not a savant quarterback or anything, though, so you still probably trust the floor with the Pats. It should be pretty high in this game. At number 12, I have the Browns versus the Chargers, and the Chargers should win, but they won't put up over 24 points on offense, most likely. That's not what they do, and the Browns should be a safe play. In general, the Chargers don't turn it over, though, so the ceiling is a bit capped with Cleveland. At 13, I have the Ravens versus Denver, and the Broncos offense doesn't scare you, but the Ravens defense has not showed up this year, especially in the secondary. They should be fine overall, but there is some risk given they could give up a ton of second half yards to the Broncos that deflate their fantasy value. I think they're okay, but just a streaming option, not top 12 this week. At 14, I do think the Bengals are also interesting to stream. Anytime you get Minshew, it is an upgrade overall, but the Bengals are not a safe team to trust, so I can't rank them top 10. I think they're barely top 15. I could see upset potential in this game. At number 15, I have the Bucks at the Chiefs, and the Chiefs offense is not quite right. Even though they're better lately, these games are usually ugly, and even though their secondary is bad, I could see the Bucks stepping up and offering a decent floor in this game. At number 16, I have the Raiders at Cincinnati, and that's probably the last defense I would consider streaming. But the Bengals are on upset watch. I do think the Raiders defense can contribute. Their front seven is legit, and I could see some fumbles. Maybe one gets returned for a touchdown. At 17, I'm probably benching these defenses moving forward, but McVay's defense usually dominates Geno. So I think the Rams at Seattle are not the worst option overall. I could see some interceptions and sacks all game long. At number 18, against Baltimore, I don't think you ever want to test that matchup, but the Broncos are a good defense this year. This is probably the lowest rank I give you on them this season. So you would think they'd be ranked lower against Lamar, but still they somewhat have a competitive chance here. I think the Broncos are top 20, but you're probably benching them more likely than not. The Ravens could hang 40 pretty easily. Number 19, I have the Lions at the Packers, and the Packers versus Detroit right behind them back to back. In division, this game should remain close and weird stuff will happen, but the offenses can both turn it into a shootout, and both teams can go negative on defense this week. So I'll bench them if I can. There is some upside in terms of turnover potential, but without a defensive score, I don't think you get more than 8 points from either of them. Number 21, I have the Falcons versus Dallas, and this game could be a shootout. No thank you. Vikings versus the Colts also could be a shootout. They've given up a ton of yards in the passing game lately. They are not as good as they were to start the year. I'm not convinced they're top 5 rest of season either. Number 23, I have the Panthers versus the Saints. Don't trust New Orleans, but definitely don't trust Carolina. So even in division, no thank you. The Giants also in division versus the Commanders. They actually did play very well against them in week 2, but I only see like a 6-point best case scenario here. So not many turnovers should be expected. I'd rather pass on the Giants. And at 25, I think I'm not trusting the Cowboys just yet. They do get Deron Bland, but not Micah Parsons. And the Falcons offense has played well. There's high shootout potential, so no thank you with the Cowboys. At 26, the Seahawks. I don't want to test McVay and Stafford with a healthy offense. No thanks with Seattle. 27, the Bears could definitely lay an egg once again, but this defense is still pretty bad. I'll avoid them. 28, the Colts at the Vikings. You're hoping for a Darnold collapse, but it's more likely that the Vikings score over 35, so no thanks with the Colts. 29, the Dolphins at Buffalo. Fuck no versus Josh Allen. And then the Jags, last defense ranked. Fuck no versus Jalen Hurts and Saquon. That is a bad bet to make. So that's it for this video. If you enjoyed, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. But here on the screen are my top 20 quarterback, tight end, and defensive rankings. And at quarterback, I feel like the position is very deep this week. I think all the way through Caleb Williams, Matthew Stafford, I think the floor is pretty safe for at least 16 points guaranteed. But given your format, you probably only start the top 12. I think once you hit Patrick Mahomes, Bo Nix, that's probably more likely the cutoff point this week. Goff does not have a unlocked ceiling, just a decent floor in this game. So starting with number 15 through 18, I think those are interesting desperation options. But with Geno Smith after that point, I'd probably bench all of those guys unless it was a 2-quarterback league where I was a bit more desperate. So quarterback is good this week. It should be fine. And I do like the upside a lot for guys like Darnold and Flacco, as well as Cousins a bit against Dallas. But at tight end, I feel like the top 15, honestly, are going to be very good. Even Gesicki at 16 should have a high floor himself. So tight end is all of a sudden a very deep position. And I do think all the way through Evan Engram, you have a very safe volume floor. With Mark Andrews, that's where the touchdown dependency does factor in. So good luck there. And then at defense, I think all the way through the Browns versus the Chargers, there is a safe floor as well. Defense has some good streaming options like the Eagles and Commanders off the wire are pretty good. Titans and Patriots also pretty appealing. So, but that's it for me. I did keep this video under an hour and I do not want to exceed my target goal. So I will say goodbye. I'll see you next time. My name's Adam Riancho and thank you for watching Nice and Blunt.